The room held maybe 60 people. Folding chairs set in 8 rows, a portable projector screen at the front, and a folding table where a woman named Sandra had arranged a stack of manila folders the thickness of a small-town phone book. She wore a university lanyard and a gray blazer, and she stood with the particular posture of someone who had spent 15 years explaining agronomic data to rooms full of farmers who would rather be in their fields. Roy sat in the 3rd row on the aisle in a canvas barn coat that was the same one he'd worn to his daughter's high school graduation 9 years before. The coat had a tear along the left pocket that had been mended with upholstery thread, the wrong color, and it showed. He had driven 40 minutes in his 1998 pickup with 280,000 miles on it, and he'd arrived early enough to pour a cup of bad coffee from the percolator by the door, and he'd found a seat, and he'd waited. Carl sat in the back row. Roy knew because Darlene had come in behind her father and whispered it quietly before she took the chair beside him. Carl had driven a county extension truck, white with a green door decal, and he'd parked it near the exit. Roy didn't turn around. Sandra laid the first transparency on the projector and let the number fill the screen. 5.8%. She said it plainly, the way you read a thermometer. This, she said, is the highest organic matter reading we have recorded from a working row crop operation in this extension district in 21 years of formal testing. The room was quiet the way a room gets when 40 farmers are doing the same arithmetic at the same moment. Roy looked at his hands on his knees. He did not speak. He had not come to speak. Let me tell you how a number like that gets made. It starts, most often, with a loss you didn't cause. In Roy's case, the loss was a winter afternoon in January of 1986, when he was 23 years old and still working alongside his father on a rented quarter section 12 miles south of Beardstown. The farm credit crisis had been building for 2 years by then, and Roy's father, whose name was Harold, had rented that ground at a rate that made sense in 1979 and made no sense at all in 1985. The lender sent a letter in November. Harold read it at the kitchen table and set it down without saying anything. Roy went to the auction. He stood at the back of the lot with his hands in his coat pockets and watched strangers walk the field rows where he had driven a tractor since he was 11. The auctioneer's voice carried on the January wind. Harold did not come. Roy understood why. His mother, Elva, pressed something into his hand that evening. It was a composition notebook, the black and white kind, its cover warped from years on a damp shelf. She had kept it since 1961, recording the condition of every plot of ground she'd ever gardened or helped tend, pH readings she'd had done at the elevator, descriptions of what came up where and why, notes on what the soil smelled like after a rain. It was not a scientific document. It was a farmer's record kept by a woman who understood that ground has a memory, and that memory can be read if you know how to look. Your father never looked at it, she said. Roy didn't answer. He put the notebook in the inside pocket of his coat, the same way you'd carry something you intend to carry for a long time. He spent the next 5 years working hired out on other men's ground, saving. He did not rent. He watched 2 more farm sales in that time, both of them men who'd leveraged their rented acres into payments they couldn't cover when prices dropped. Roy watched, and he saved, and he said very little, which was a habit he kept for the rest of his life. By 1991, he had enough to buy 240 acres outright on the south edge of Cass County, ground his grandfather had once described as some of the best river-bottom loam in central Illinois. He paid $410 an acre, and he paid cash. The deed went into a file folder inside an old metal lockbox, and the lockbox went under the bed in the farmhouse, and Roy put Elva's notebook on the kitchen shelf where he could see it from the table. He planted his first cover crop that fall, winter rye mixed with hairy vetch, tilled lightly under the following spring. The seed had cost him $314 at the regional supplier in Beardstown, which was money Roy had not spent on cover crop seed in the preceding 10 years of working other men's ground, because the men in question had not been interested in cover crops. The supplier, an older man named Chet Halverson, had filled the order without comment, but had asked, when Roy went to settle up at the counter, whether the seed was for the new place south of town. Roy said it was. Chet said he had filled a similar order for Roy's mother in 1974, when Elva was still tending her own plot behind the house. Roy had not known that. He took the receipt and put it in his shirt pocket and asked Chet what Elva had ordered. Chet thought for a moment. "Winter rye and crimson clover," he said. "Not vetch. Same idea, though." Roy thanked him. He drove home and took Elva's notebook off the kitchen shelf and looked through the 1974 entries. He found the page. She had recorded the seed mix and the seeding rate, and a note about the way the ground had felt the following spring, soft under the foot in a way it had not felt the previous April. Roy seeded his 80-acre west field over a Wednesday and Thursday in October of 1991, using a borrowed drill from a neighbor named Linwood Apple, who had run a small no-till operation on river-bottom ground for 15 years, and who was one of the very few men in Cass County in 1991 who had any experience with the practice Roy was about to begin. Linwood had brought the drill over himself, towed behind his own tractor, and he had stayed for an hour walking the field with Roy and explaining the seeding rate adjustments for his particular soil profile. Roy had not asked him to stay. Linwood had stayed because that was the way he was built. He pointed out a low spot on the south edge of the field where standing water would compromise the rye stand and said Roy ought to think about a small drainage cut. He said he could come back in the spring with his backhoe if Roy wanted. Roy said he would think about it. They shook hands, and Linwood drove home, and Roy worked until dark seeding the field. He pulled soil samples that autumn and sent them to the university lab. The organic matter reading came back at 2.1%, which was about what you'd expect from ground that had been conventionally tilled and input-fed for 30 years. He wrote the number in the margin of Elva's notebook. Carl Weiss arrived in June of 1997. He was the Cass County Extension Agent, a trim man in his mid-40s who drove a county truck and wore pressed shirts and had a master's degree from Champaign-Urbana. He was not a bad man. He was a confident one, which in certain professions amounts to the same liability. He walked the field rows with Roy for an hour, asking questions and writing notes on a clipboard, and Roy answered him plainly and without elaboration. At the end of the hour, Carl stopped near the south fence line and looked back across the field. The cover crop had been terminated and the corn was in, but the residue still showed across the surface, and there was a visible difference in the soil color in the rows where Roy had concentrated compost application. "Roy," Carl said, "I'm going to be straight with you. This ground is low on available nitrogen. Your tillage is minimal at best. You're not incorporating your amendments the way you need to for this soil profile. I'm going to file a report with the office, and my recommendation is that you move to a conventional input program. We can get you on a plan." Roy looked at the same piece of ground Carl was looking at. "I appreciate you coming out," he said. Carl filed the report. It was a formal document, 2 pages, and it described Roy's 240-acre operation as low yield and input deficient, a farm operating below the agronomic potential of its soil class. Roy read it when it arrived in the mail. He put it in the metal lockbox under the bed on top of the deed. Darlene was 9 years old that summer. She had watched Carl walk the fields from the farmhouse porch, standing on the bottom rail of the wooden railing the way kids do, elbows hooked over the top. She couldn't hear the conversation from the house, but she saw the way Carl gestured at the field and the way her father watched him, and said little. She hopped down from the rail when Carl's truck pulled back down the drive. Here is what you need to understand about that report. In 1997, an extension agent's written assessment could carry weight with agricultural lenders. It was the kind of document that, if you were seeking to refinance or borrow against operations, could complicate the conversation. Roy had no debt to refinance and no desire to borrow, so the report landed with the force of a stone thrown at a paid-off building. It made a sound and did nothing else. Across the county road from Roy's south field, Mitch Grover was farming 300 acres he'd inherited from an uncle, and he was listening to Carl very closely. Mitch was a good-natured man, the kind of farmer who knew everyone's name and remembered who'd helped at whose harvest, and brought smoked sausage to the co-op Christmas party every year. He was not reckless. He believed what he was told by people whose credentials outranked his, which was the straightforward and widely shared mistake at the center of what happened to him. In 1998, Mitch took out a note of $280,000 and purchased 400 additional acres at the going rate. Carl had spoken well of the ground, and the lender's appraiser had agreed, and the numbers made sense on a conventional input program at projected commodity prices. Roy drove past the closing party at Mitch's house on a Friday evening in March of 1998 and waved from the road. Mitch waved back from the porch. Roy pulled another soil sample that same fall. The organic matter had climbed to 2.6%. He noted it in Elva's journal in the margin beside her entry from 1963 about what happened to a garden plot in a dry summer when the organic matter was thin. He had started to hear her voice in those old entries, the same patient, observational voice you develop when you've watched something long enough to understand it. He kept his yields modest and his costs low. In 1999, he averaged 151 bushels per acre on corn, which was below the county average of 159. Carl noted this in a follow-up conversation at the elevator in Beardstown. "Roy," he said over the scratch of a grain receipt being printed, "you're giving up yield. You know that." "I'm watching," Roy said. Carl shook his head slightly, the way a man does when he's decided that patience is indistinguishable from stubbornness. By 2003, Roy's organic matter test had come back at 3.9%. His corn yields had climbed to 171 bushels per acre, still not county average, but climbing on a curve that his ledger showed clearly. He had $60,000 in a passbook savings account at the Havana National Bank and an unencumbered title to 240 acres in the lockbox under the bed. In the spring of 2003, he drove to an estate auction 8 miles north and bought 60 additional acres for $2,040 per acre. He wrote the check from the savings account. The auctioneer barely registered the transaction. Roy brought the new deed home, put it in the lockbox beside the first one, and planted winter wheat cover that fall. If there was a controlled CTA-aside moment in this story, it would be here, and it would be simple. If you've been watching this channel for a while, you already know where this goes. If you're new, stay where you are because the next part is where it gets specific. The numbers are the point. They always are. Mitch had expanded again. In 2003, he bought another 200 acres, this time at $2,600 per acre, on a second note. By 2006, he'd added 200 more at $3,200 an acre, leveraged against the rising value of his existing holdings. His operations sat at 1,100 acres by 2007, and Carl spoke of it at the County Farm Bureau meeting that year as an example of what modern input-intensive farming could accomplish with sound agronomic guidance. Roy attended the meeting. He sat in the back, drank coffee, and left when it was over. Darlene had graduated from the University of Illinois in 2004 with a degree in agronomy. She had come home to the farm on a Friday evening in May of that year, still wearing her graduation clothes, and she'd walked the south field with her father until the light was gone. She didn't take a job elsewhere. She had looked at the soil data her father had been collecting for 13 years, and she had made a simple calculation about where she wanted to be. By 2007, she was running the daily operations alongside Roy, taking soil samples, managing the cover crop seeding, and keeping a second notebook, her own, where she tracked every input cost and every yield figure and every lab result in a hand that looked nothing like Elva's, but served the same purpose. There was a Saturday morning in April of 2007 that worth describing here because it carried the texture of those years better than the summary does. Roy was up at 5:15 and out at the equipment shed by 5:30, and Darlene came out at 6 with 2 cups of coffee and a clipboard. The planter was a 1996 John Deere 7,206 row that Roy had bought, used in 2001, for $14,000 cash from a farmer near Petersburg who was retiring. The unit had needed new seed meter brushes and a hydraulic line that spring, and Roy had ordered the parts through Chet Halverson's son, who had taken over the supplier counter when Chet retired in 2003. Darlene set the clipboard down on the planter frame. She had pulled soil moisture readings from each of the 3 quarter sections the previous afternoon, and the readings were on the clipboard in her hand. South quarter is at 22% at the 4-inch, she said. North is at 19. East is at 24. Roy looked at the numbers. East can wait 2 days, he said. South and north today. I think so, Darlene said. They worked together through the morning. Roy ran the planter, and Darlene ran the seed tender truck, and they stopped at 9:30 for a second coffee at the back of the truck. Darlene had a question about the corn population on the north quarter, where the lighter, sandy ground always ran a little behind the heavier soils to the south. She wanted to drop the seeding rate by 2,000 seeds per acre on the north only. Roy thought about it. He said he had run that experiment in 1998, and it had cost him about 3 bushels per acre on the north side that year. Darlene asked what the organic matter had been on the north side in 1998. Roy thought. He said 2.8. Darlene said the north side was at 4.1 now. She said the soil had a different water-holding capacity than it had in 1998, and the seeding rate that had been wrong then might not be wrong now. Roy looked at her for a moment. He said, "Run it? 2,000 under on the north only. Mark the boundary." She marked the boundary on the field map with a pencil, and they went back to work. The rate adjustment came in at 32,000 seeds per acre on the north and 34,000 on the south, and the resulting stand counts in late May confirmed that Darlene's read had been correct. The north quarter would yield 184 bushels per acre that fall against the south's 192, which was the closest the 2 parcels had ever come, and the input cost on the north quarter dropped by $28 per acre on the lower seed rate. She wrote both figures in her notebook in the column she had been keeping since 2004. The 2008 Cass County Ag Banquet. was held in November at the Elks Lodge in Beardstown. There were round tables and a catered dinner and a podium, and the County Farm Bureau presented its annual service awards, and Carl Wise spoke about the state of the local agricultural economy. Carl spoke well. He had a measured, credentialed confidence that wore well in a room, and he presented the commodity price data and the input cost trends with the kind of organized authority that made people feel someone was managing the situation. He mentioned the farms that had demonstrated strong agronomic performance under conventional programs. He mentioned Mitch by name. Then he said something else, and the room heard it, and Roy heard it, and so did Darlene. There are still a few operations in this county, Carl said, that are leaving bushels in the ground by refusing to follow established agronomic practice. Soil that tests as input deficient doesn't improve by itself. He didn't say Roy's name. He didn't need to. There were 40 farmers in that room, and 30 of them knew exactly which farm he was describing. Darlene, 26 years old, gripped the handle of her coffee cup with both hands. Roy did not look up from his plate. He drove home that night and went directly to the lockbox under the bed. He took out Carl's 1997 report and read it again, all 2 pages, and then he put it back and closed the lid. He did not make a note of what he felt. The journal was for the land, not for that. In 2009, the commodity price collapse met the credit, tightening in the way that a dry summer meets a spark. Mitch had been carrying 3 separate notes, totaling approximately $1,400,000 against an operation that had relied on input margins that no longer held. His lender called the loan reviews in February. By April, Mitch's bank had initiated foreclosure proceedings on 900 of his 1,100 acres. Roy drove past Mitch's place on a Tuesday morning in March and saw the equipment lined up along the drive with numbers taped to the windshields. He stopped. He rolled the window down in the cold air. Mitch was standing by his tractor, an almost new machine he'd taken delivery of in 2007, and his face held the specific exhaustion of a man who has not slept in weeks and has no clear path back to sleep. "Mitch," Roy said. Mitch looked at the tractor's front tire. "Didn't see it coming fast enough," he said. "That's all it was." Roy sat with that for a moment. "You need anything," he said. Mitch shook his head, not as an answer, just as a motion his body made before he was ready to speak. Roy put the window back up and drove on. He was not satisfied. A man does not feel vindication watching his neighbor's equipment lined up for auction. He felt something closer to the January cold of 1986, that same combination of stillness and sadness that comes when you watch something preventable run all the way to its end. That winter, the winter of 2009, Roy sat at the kitchen table late on a February night when Darlene had gone to bed. The lamp over the table made a yellow circle on the cloth. He had his soil notebooks out, Elva's and Darlene's both, and he had the lab reports going back 18 years, and he had a legal pad where he'd been writing numbers for an hour. His organic matter reading from the fall of 2009 had come in at 5.3%. His average yield on corn for 2009 had been 188 bushels per acre. The county average for 2009 had been 158. His cost per bushel was lower than it had been in years, because his input requirements were lower, because the soil was doing work that the inputs used to have to do. The numbers were there. They had always been there. He sat with them anyway because there was a version of the question that the numbers didn't entirely answer. The version that asks whether anyone outside this kitchen will ever look at these figures the way they need to be looked at. He was 60 years old, and he had been doing this for 18 years against the written recommendation of the county extension office, and he did not have a university lanyard, and he was aware of what that meant in a room where credentialed authority spoke from a podium. Darlene had appeared in the kitchen doorway at some point. He wasn't sure exactly when. She was in a robe, and her hair was loose, and she'd seen the notebooks out. And she'd sat down without being asked and looked at the legal pad. "We should go to the field day," she said. "In 2012, when they do the organic matter study, we should submit the full data set." Roy looked at the lamp. "Carl's on the extension committee." "Sandra Wise runs the university side," Darlene said. "She doesn't work for Carl. She works for the university." Roy folded the legal pad and set it on top of Elva's notebook. "Okay," he said. The years between 2009 and 2012 were the years when the arithmetic became undeniable, at least to Roy and Darlene, if not yet to the room that needed to hear it. Roy's yields climbed. His fall 2011 soil test came back at 5.6% organic matter. The 300 acres he owned, the original 240 plus the 60 he'd bought in 2003 for cash, were producing at a rate that looked on paper like a different class of ground than the county average. In the spring of 2012, Darlene compiled the data. She had 15 years of formal soil test results, full corn and soybean yield records, input cost ledgers, and the sequential entries from Elva's notebook annotated with the lab data that confirmed or complicated each of her grandmother's observations. She organized it the way she had been taught in Champaign-Urbana, with citations and margins and a cover page, and she submitted it to the University of Illinois Extension Program for their fall field day. Sandra's office called the farm a week later. Sandra herself was on the phone. She had looked at the data, she said, and she had some questions. The call lasted 45 minutes. At the end of it, Sandra said she would like to present the Thornton Farm data as the featured case study at the October field day. Roy was standing at the kitchen counter when Darlene told him. He nodded and went back outside. The thing about that moment is that it had no ceremony in it, which was exactly right. Roy had not been doing this to be featured at a field day. He had been doing it because his mother's notebook had shown him that ground has a memory, and because a January auction in 1986 had shown him what happens when you don't own the thing you farm, and because 18 years of his own data had confirmed what Elva's handwriting had pointed toward from the beginning. Sandra's invitation was not the vindication. It was the moment someone else with a university lanyard and a stack of peer-reviewed literature looked at the same numbers and arrived at the same place Roy had been standing since 1997. Carl Weiser learned he would be attending the October field day from a memo issued by the Extension Office. His name was listed among the county extension staff expected to be present. He did not reach out to Roy before the event. Roy didn't expect him to. October arrived cool and clear. Darlene drove, and Roy sat in the passenger seat with Elva's notebook in his lap, which was the only thing he brought. They pulled into the gravel lot at the metal building, and Roy poured bad coffee from the percolator by the door and found a seat in the third row on the aisle. He did not look for Carl. Darlene found the seat beside him and told him quietly where Carl was sitting, and Roy did not turn around. Sandra organized her folders. The room filled. Most of the people there were farmers, men and women who worked Cass County and the counties adjacent, who had driven county roads for decades and knew most of the names in the room without needing introductions. Mitch came in and sat near the middle. He had a notepad on his knee and an expression that Roy recognized as the look of a man who has lost something important and is now paying very close attention to everything. Sandra began. She went through the data in sequence, the way a researcher presents, starting with methodology and moving to findings. She put Roy's baseline organic matter reading on the screen, 2.1% in 1991, and she walked through the management inputs, the cover crop species mix, the reduced tillage program, the compost incorporation schedule. She put the year-by-year soil test results up as a chart, a steady rising line across 21 years. The 2012 reading was 5.8%. She put it on the screen and let the room do its arithmetic. The county average for Cass County in 2012 was 2.4%. She put that on the screen beneath Roy's figure. Sandra let both numbers sit there side by side without comment, which was itself a form of comment that required no elaboration. She then displayed the yield data. Roy's 2012 corn yield was 198 bushels per acre. The county average for 2012 was 161 bushels per acre. The difference of 37 bushels per acre multiplied across 300 owned acres represented a material and recurring advantage that had no debt attached to it, because the soil itself was doing the work and the soil was paid for. She cited 2 peer-reviewed Illinois studies showing that each 1% increase in soil organic matter corresponded with approximately 20 additional bushels per acre of yield potential under central Illinois growing conditions. Roy had gained 3.7% organic matter. The yield data bore the relationship out almost exactly. "This is documented," Sandra said. "Over 21 years of continuous, formal soil testing with complete yield records and input cost ledgers. It is, to my knowledge, the most complete producer-level organic matter data set in this extension district." She paused and looked at the room. "I want to acknowledge," she said, "that in 1997 this farm received a formal extension assessment characterizing it as input deficient and low yield. That assessment is in the record. What we are looking at today is also in the record. I will let the data speak." Roy heard the room shift in the way that rooms shift when a number lands and there is no dispute available. Not a sound exactly. A settling. 40 people in folding chairs recalibrating the same moment. He did not look at Carl. Darlene did not look at Carl. Mitch, in the middle of the room, was writing something on his notepad. Carl sat in the back row for the remainder of Sandra's presentation, which ran another 20 minutes and covered the economic implications of the Thornton data and its potential as a model for other Cass County operators. When Sandra finished and opened for questions, Carl did not raise his hand. When the presentation ended and the room moved toward the coffee table and a spread of county fair pastries, Carl gathered his folder and his county truck keys and walked toward the door. He passed Roy's row. He stopped. Roy looked up at him. Carl's face held the particular expression of a man who has understood something that was available for understanding for a long time and has arrived at it too late to change the sequence of events that the earlier understanding would have changed. "Roy," Carl said. Roy waited. "I was wrong about your ground." Carl's voice was level, the way a man speaks when he is saying something difficult in public and has decided to say it plainly rather than not at all. "I should have looked at the direction you were heading, not the baseline." Roy looked at him for a moment. "I appreciate you saying so," he said. Carl nodded once and moved toward the door. He did not stop at the coffee table. Darlene put her hand on her father's arm for a moment and then took it away. Mitch made his way over after the room had thinned. He still had the notepad. He looked at the floor near Roy's boots when he arrived. "I should have come over and asked what you were doing," Mitch said. "All those years, I kept meaning to." "I know it," Roy said. "You were busy." "Carl told me your ground was going backward." Mitch paused. I believed him. Roy looked at him. "The ground never lies," he said. Give it enough time and it'll tell you everything. Mitch wrote something on his notepad and folded it into his shirt pocket. Whether he was writing a number or a sentence was not something Roy asked about. By the spring of 2013, Roy had received 2 purchase inquiries on his 300 acres, one from a land investment fund and one from a neighboring operation looking to expand. The fund's representative came to the farm in a company truck and sat at the kitchen table and offered Roy $3,800 per acre. Roy listened politely and declined. His land was appraised that spring at approximately $4,200 per acre, and Roy filed the appraisal in the lockbox under the bed next to Carl's 1997 report and both deeds. He was 61 years old. He had 300 acres paid in full, a soil profile that outperformed the county by the margin Sandra had put on a projector screen, and no debt of any kind. He also had a call from June Polly. June was 24, the granddaughter of an older neighbor named Ed Polly, who had sold his place in 2010 and moved to town. She had a degree in sustainable agriculture from a downstate school and no land and no money to buy any, which was the standard condition of beginning farmers in central Illinois in 2013 and remained so. She had been renting a small plot on shares east of town and running it well, and she had called Roy because Sandra had mentioned his name at a follow-up extension meeting. Roy drove out and looked at what June was doing with her rented ground. He spent 2 hours walking it and asking her questions. Her answers were specific and patient, and she knew exactly what her organic matter baseline was and what direction she was trying to move it. He drove home and sat at the table with Darlene. "She's good," he said. "Yes," Darlene said. "She needs ground. She can't afford county rate." Roy looked at the kitchen shelf where Elva's notebook sat with Darlene's notebook stacked beside it, the 2 spines together. "She doesn't need to afford county rate," he said. He offered June Polly a lease on 80 acres of his 300, the eastern parcel he'd bought in 2003, at $60 per acre per year. The county lease rate was running $140. He included a first option to purchase at a fixed price, good for 10 years, and he gave her the first season's lease on a handshake, with paperwork to follow. June stood on the near edge of that 80-acre parcel on a May morning in 2013 and walked it the way you walk new ground, slowly and close to the surface. When she stopped and looked back across it, her expression was the specific look of a person who has been given something they intended to earn and now understands they will have to earn it in a different direction by doing the work correctly over time. That was the look Roy had been wearing for 22 years. Darlene formally took over the farm operations in the summer of 2013. It was not a ceremony. She had been doing the work for years, and what changed was the paperwork, the operating accounts put in her name, the equipment titles transferred. Roy stayed on the ground every day. He just moved to the passenger seat, which was not a significant change in a man who had never been interested in appearing to be in charge. He took Elva's notebook from the kitchen shelf and gave it to Darlene. She set it on the kitchen shelf in the same place. Her own notebook went beside it, as it had been. There is a version of this story that makes Roy out to be a man who was proved right by one number on a projector screen. But that is not the correct version. The correct version is slower, and it smells like turned soil and mended canvas, and it runs from a January auction in 1986 to a May morning in 2013, and its arithmetic is patient, and its logic is simple. Take care of the ground. Own what you farm. Do not borrow money against what you cannot control. The dog was a hound named Gravel that Darlene had picked up at the county shelter 3 years earlier and that had taken to Roy in the firm, uncritical way that working dogs take to the person who gets up earliest. Gravel followed Roy across every field Roy walked in the years after the field day, at the same respectful distance, pausing when Roy paused, sitting when Roy knelt to look at the soil. Carl Weiss remained the Cass County Extension agent until he retired in 2016. He attended the field day each year after 2012, and in 2014, he co-presented a session on organic matter management that cited the Thornton Farm data as a primary reference. He did not discuss this with Roy directly. Roy did not require the discussion. Mitch recovered pieces of his operation in the years after the foreclosure, renting ground and running a tighter program. He came to Roy's place in the fall of 2014 and asked if he could look at the soil testing records. Roy handed him Darlene's notebook and told him to take his time. Mitch sat at the kitchen table for an hour and wrote several pages of notes. He thanked Roy and left and came back the following spring with a bucket of winter rye seed and a question about seeding rates. By the fall of 2015, June's 80 acres had tested at 2.9% organic matter, up from 2.2 at her baseline in 2013. She had run a red clover and oat cover crop and incorporated a modest compost application, and her yields had come in at 167 bushels per acre, which was above the county average in a difficult year. She drove to Roy's house and left a paper bag on the porch step with a note that said, "Thank you for the ground." Inside the bag was a jar of honey from a hive she kept at the east edge of the parcel, and a copy of her soil test results. Roy read the test results at the kitchen table that evening. He found the organic matter number, 2.9%, and he looked at it for a moment, and then he took a pencil and wrote it in the margin of Elva's notebook, beside an entry from 1969 that described the smell of the east plot in wet spring when the soil was ready for seed. He closed the notebook and set it on the shelf. Gravel had come in from the porch and settled at the foot of Roy's chair, the way a dog does when it has decided the day is complete. Roy sat for a while with his coffee. Through the kitchen window, the last of the October light was going out across the field, the soil dark and patient and keeping its own accounts, the way it always had, the way it always would.